Hi everyone, welcome to your online lecture covering the topic tissues. Now you don't need to write this detail down, but just to give you a bit of an introduction as to what a tissue is. A tissue is a group of similar cells that are going to perform a common function. Remember, cells come together to form tissues, and then various tissues will come together to form organs, which we will be getting into later on in this course. The term tissue literally means fabric, and so you can think of tissue as being the fabric of the human body, and it's sort of sewn all together to form the different organs that make up our body. Now, tissues are composed of cells, we know, but they're also composed of something called extracellular matrix. So let's have a look at the brief definition of these three terms. The first one being cells. Cells, they're living units and they're going to provide a very specific function, but they also can support the extracellular matrix. Tissues, we know, are groups of cells that are going to perform a common function. And the extracellular matrix is this fluid environment that we'll talk more about later, but it's non-living, it's considered complex. We describe it as intracellular because it's found in between cells. So surrounding the cells, and the amount and type of extracellular matrix is going to depend on the type of tissue that it's present within, and it's going to contribute to the characteristics of that tissue. We're going to spend some time now talking about the extracellular matrix, that non-living material that is found in between cells. It's going to consist of water, proteins, glycoproteins, and proteoglycans, of which we will elaborate on next. But what they do is they form these large bundles or complexes that are going to bind together, but also bind to the plasma membrane. And it binds to the plasma membrane using what's called integrin proteins that are found in the plasma membrane. And so the binding that's happening between the different components of the extracellular membrane as well as to the cell itself is going to promote structural integrity, kind of keeping everything together. It's also going to allow for communication and coordination within the tissue. The shown in this diagram will look more in the next slide, but you can see a proteoglycan complex here. And it's made up of, it's got a core protein, it has carbohydrates, you can see the polysaccharide molecule shown here. And then this here, zooming in, is a collagen fiber. And you can see how there's some attachment to the plasma membrane, but then there's all these other structures here that it attaches to as well. Okay. So we know that the extracellular matrix is composed of these four substances here. So let's look at these components in terms of their structure and their function. Starting with water. Water is going to behave as a solvent, as it oftentimes does, providing some fluidity to the extracellular membrane. Glycoproteins. These, you can see glyco in the term, that's referring to carbohydrate, and then proteins is obvious. So these are proteins that contain a carbohydrate attached to it. And in terms of the function of the glycoproteins, they're going to allow for specifically communication within a tissue. The proteoglycans, these have a core protein backbone as shown on the briefly introduced on the previous slide. It's also got a carbohydrate component held together by a polysaccharide chain, and I did show you that already here. And in terms of the purpose of the proteoglycans, they have a lubrication component where they're going to allow for some thickening of the fluid that exists there, but also allowing, and because of that, allowing for shock absorption. And then the protein fibers, these are going to vary in quantity depending on the tissue that we're talking about, but these are long strands of proteins that are going to provide the structural support to the tissue. So you can see that the extracellular matrix consisting of these four components is going to contribute to some fluidity of the cell, but also some shock absorption, communication, and structural support. We're going to spend some time now looking at body membranes, and this slide is just an overview of them before we get into a lot more detail. The term membrane refers to just a thin sheet-like structure, and it can have many different important functions in the body depending on where it's located. Some of the examples here include covering and protecting the body surface, so your skin, lining body cavities, lining internal organs. It's going to also line hollow organs in our body. So a hollow organ, for example, would be your stomach or your bladder, among others. It's going to contribute to anchoring organs to one another or even structures to bones. It's going to secrete a lubricating fluid, and that lubricating fluid is going to work to prevent friction that would otherwise inevitably happen as our organs move. Even as our heart beats, as we breathe in and out, friction would be generated if it wasn't for the protection from this lubricating fluid. And even between our bones and our joints, the lubrication prevents wear and tear. Some membranes are going to be either considered epithelial and others are going to be considered connective tissue membranes. So these are the major categories of or types of body membranes. So just a brief introduction of each. Epithelial membrane, wouldn't surprise you that it's made up of epithelial tissue. And we'll see what this looks like later, but the epithelial tissue, or the cells that make up the tissue, are going to be sort of held down on a basement membrane, kind of like a foundation, with connective tissue then beneath it. But once you see what that looks like, it should make more sense. But when we talk about connective tissue, there aren't epithelial cells present. It's going to be exclusively made up of specific types of connective tissue. Okay, so the epithelial membrane then is made up of epithelial tissue, and the connective tissue membrane is made up of connective tissue. But unfortunately, it's not quite that simple, and we'll get into detail coming up. We're going to now talk more about epithelial membranes, which we know are made up of epithelial cells that make an epithelial tissue. And there are three main membrane types. So we have serous membranes, mucous membranes, and cutaneous membranes, all of which are epithelial membranes. So that means that each of these membranes here are going to be composed of epithelial cells, which make up epithelial tissue. But they get a specific name here because they have slightly different function. So we're going to start with the serous membrane. Serous membranes are going to line cavities that are not open to the external environment and cover many of the organs within this cavity, within these cavities. And so sometimes we call these serous membranes serosa instead of just calling it a serous membrane. Now let's elaborate on what this means. If we look up at this image here, you can see what's outlined in purple and what's outlined in blue. These are serous membranes. So it's lining parts of the structure on the abdomen, the lungs, and shown here the stomach. And then there's many other organs of the body that also have a serous membrane that's not shown here. But what these membranes are going to do is produce a thin watery fluid that lubricates the organs. So the fluid that's around these organs here are going to prevent any friction that could occur if the fluid wasn't there. So it's a lubrication because our stomach's always moving, our abdomen's moving, our lungs, our heart, among other organs. The last thing I wanted to point out is that you can see both blue and purple here. These are your serous membranes, and serous membranes are divided into two membrane layers. One that's called the parietal layer and one that's called the visceral layer. Viscera means organ. So the visceral layer or visceral membrane is going to be what actually covers the surface of organs. So if you look closely, you can see when it comes to the lungs that we have a blue inner layer here, which is that visceral membrane. And then if the heart was shown here, you would see the same thing, that it also has a visceral membrane and a parietal membrane. And you can see the parietal membrane on the outside. So this is just on the outside then of the visceral membrane. You'll see terms here such as peritoneum and pleura. These will come up later on in the course, but pleura just refers to lungs, peritoneum refers to the abdomen. So these are just the coverings that would be found on the abdominal organs and the lungs. But these again are just a couple of examples. Let's look at what the cells look like in this image here. We're going to be talking about the different cells and what they mean when they look a particular way. But in the case of a serous membrane, we have these epithelial cells here because we know that a serous membrane is an epithelial membrane, so it's going to be made up of epithelial cells. But these particular cells are going to secrete a serous fluid, and that fluid is what's going to be lubricating the organs. So it's going to be secreted all through here so that as your lungs move while you breathe, there's nice lubrication to prevent friction, injury, and pain. Now we're going to have a look at mucous membranes. And in this image here, you can see mucous membranes are shown in certain regions, but it's only showing you up through here. There are other mucous membranes in the body as well. But in terms of their description, they line the surfaces that are open directly to the exterior environment. So it might surprise you that our respiratory tract, so where we breathe air in through our nose or mouth and to the back of our throat and into our trachea, also some people call it the windpipe, all of that's open to the external environment. Our digestive system is open to the external environment because food goes into an opening, which is your mouth. Our urinary system, our reproductive tracts, they all have openings from the outside in. So they're considered to be in contact with the external environment. And so they're lined with mucous membranes. Mucous membranes are they're very clinically important because they're going to be interacting quite frequently with microorganisms. So microorganisms can get into your nasal passageway, they can get into your mouth and throat, of course, they can get into your digestive tract, into the urethra where urine should come out of, into the vaginal tract in women, or the vaginal canal in women. So clinically, it's very important because of its exposure to the external environment. So we have to be careful with what's exposed. The mucous membranes are going to produce a watery mucus that is going to coat and protect the cells beneath it. It's going to also lubricate food through your digestive tract. So when you swallow food and it moves throughout your stomach and throughout your digestive tract, there's lubrication there to help coat the food so it's not damaging to the cells of your tract. It also has this ability to trap contaminants. So mucus can act as this trapping mechanism for any pathogens or dust that get into those areas and come into contact with the cell walls to prevent it from becoming problematic. So for example, if you breathe in dust through your nose, there's mucus within your nose that it can get trapped in to prevent it from going all the way down into your lungs. In terms of what the tissue looks like, so here's the epithelial cells, which you can see look significantly different than the ones of serous membranes. But what's an important feature in here that will come up again later is the presence of these cells called goblet cells. And goblet cells are going to be what actually produces the mucus. Our final example is the cutaneous membrane. Cutaneous means skin. So this is going to be found, of course, all over your body. It's actually the primary organ of your integumentary system, which includes things such as, hair and that sort of thing, and your nails. Skin is obviously taking up the majority of your body. And it's going to cover your body surfaces that are exposed directly to the external environment. And so our skin actually offers a lot of protection to microorganisms that we're exposed to all the time. And that's why if you cut your skin, it's open to potential infection. And in terms of what it looks like, you can see here, I forgot to mention that our skin contains many sweat glands and oil glands, which wouldn't surprise you, but you can see the different layout of the epithelial tissue compared to the other examples. And in this example, it's just showing you the production of sweat and oil that would be on top of these cells. Okay, remember that there are two types of membranes in the body, epithelial membranes and connective tissue membranes. And we spoke quite a bit about epithelial. Now we're going to examine connective tissue membranes. And we did already speak to the fact that connective tissue membranes, they do not contain many, if any, epithelial components. The one that we're going to speak about today is called a synovial membrane. This is an example of a connective tissue membrane. Synovial membranes are smooth and very slick, and they have this ability to produce a fluid called synovial fluid. And so we find synovial membranes within joints or as part of joints, where it's going to produce that fluid to help prevent friction between the opposing surfaces of your joints. So if we look here, we can see that we have synovial fluid membranes that are going to produce synovial fluid to help prevent friction. So they are found in the spaces between bones in joints, and we'll talk a lot about joints coming up in this semester. And they're also found lining bursa, and bursa are shock absorbers that are found in various areas of the body. You can think of bursa as being these small cushion-like sacs that are present in various areas of the body. Okay, so we've looked at the two main membrane types, epithelial membranes and connective tissue membranes. Now we're going to look at the specific types of tissue that are found in the body and where they're located. And you can see that when we say the word tissue, how different areas of the body, the tissue looks remarkably different. We're going to have a look at the main types of tissue in the body, and the four main types are listed here. Epithelial tissues, we spoke about how they make up epithelial membranes and how connective tissues make up connective tissue membranes, but there are other things and other functions of these tissues which we'll talk about next. There's also nervous tissue and muscle tissue, which will come up in more detail later on in this course when we get to the nervous system unit and the muscle unit. So let's start with a brief description of each. Epithelial cells are going to be responsible for secreting many different products that aid in our overall body balance. We know that they form membranes in our body that are going to contain and protect our internal fluid environment. So what does that mean? Well, for example, our blood vessels are lined with epithelial tissue, and that keeps the blood in our blood vessels. Our bladder is lined with epithelial tissue, which keeps the urine that accumulates in the bladder in the bladder. And other examples exist too, of course. Epithelial tissue as well is responsible for moving substances in and out of our body organs. So this is where for example, when we eat food, we're going to absorb the nutrients from that food, and it's going to be absorbed through epithelial cells. So epithelial cells have the ability to secrete, to excrete, so get rid of, and absorb substances. Here is just one example of what epithelial cells can look like. We'll look at the different types coming up, but they do look different than some of the other tissue types in our body. So each of these are cells which come together to form a tissue. Next up is connective tissue. As the name suggests, it's going to connect and hold organs and various systems in our body together. It's going to be sort of a framework, the structure that supports our body but also allows us to move. And this is an image of connective tissue here, so you can see the pattern of different fibers that are moving in different directions, which is supportive in function. Nervous tissue is going to generate very complex messages that are going to be sent to all different structures in our body in order to coordinate body functions. Nervous tissue is also going to allow for communication between various parts of our body and integrate the activities that occur among various parts of our body. This is showing you a neuron, which is a nerve cell that will be talked about later on in this course. So you can see how different the tissue here looks compared to the other tissues. And then muscle tissue is going to be working alongside connective tissue, as we'll learn later in this course, to permit the movement of our body and different structures within our body. And here we have a picture of what muscle cells can look like. They're more elongated in their appearance. And the final point to make is that when you think of muscle tissue, you're probably thinking of the muscles that move our body, the muscles that you work out when you exercise. And although that is true, there are also muscles lining all other areas of our body, including our blood vessels, so that we can have the movement of blood throughout our body. We have muscle tissue that lines other structures like our bladder and our digestive tract to move food through it. Muscles found all throughout the body in different forms. But that will come up again later. So let's look closer now at specifically epithelial tissue. We know that epithelial tissue makes up epithelial membranes, but epithelial tissue is found in other areas of the body as well. In terms of how epithelial tissue looks, the cells are in close proximity to one another. You can see they're very closely and tightly packed, and they're going to be the presence of many desmosomes and tight junctions, which we've already spoken about in one of our other lectures. Epithelial tissue is designed to protect our body against the exposure of chemicals, mechanical injury, preventing foreign pathogens from causing problems. Epithelial tissue is also avascular. That means it doesn't contain any blood vessels. Epithelial tissue has this ability to reproduce, and that's necessary because of constant wear and tear. So for example, with our skin, we're constantly shedding off our skin, and then new skin cells are produced. So it's important just with normal everyday wear and tear, but also if there is injury as part of the healing process, we need to reproduce the cells that may have been lost. Many different functions, and the concept of epithelial tissue will come up again and again throughout different topics in this course because it's involved in so much. So we have spoken about some of this already, but just as some more examples, this tissue is going to allow us to detect changes in our environment and are part of our senses. So it's found in our skin, our nose, our eyes, our ears. They're going to secrete products. If we're talking about glands in our body that produce substances and they're made of epithelial tissue, it could be hormones, mucus, digestive juices, and sweat are all going to be produced by very specific epithelial cells. They're involved in the absorption of digestive nutrients, as I've already mentioned to you when you eat food. It's also going to be involved in gas exchange. So when you breathe in oxygen, that needs to go through epithelial tissue in order to get into our blood. And then it also needs to go from our blood into tissues. And in order to do that, it's crossing through epithelial tissue. It's also involved in excretion. I mentioned that term earlier, where it's assisting with getting rid of waste products. We'll learn more about this when we get to the urinary system next semester. And epithelial tissue is organized into two main layers. We have the free surface and the basement membrane. So let's have a look at this image here. The free surface, let's say this could be what's exposed to the outside world if we're talking about our skin. Then this would be called the free surface, sometimes called the apical surface. And then we have at the bottom, we have this basement membrane. This is like the foundation poured in your basement at home that has cells residing on it. So the free surface interacts with the external environment. That basement membrane is considered a permeable material, which will allow substances to pass through the basement membrane into the connective tissue beneath it. In terms of types of epithelial tissue, we've spoken already quite a bit about membranous epithelium, coverings and linings throughout our body, but there's also glandular epithelium. And glandular epithelium is going to be what secretes a substance, as I've already mentioned. And the two main types of glands that will come up later on in anatomy and physiology are endocrine glands, which produce hormones, and exocrine glands, which secrete a variety of other types of substances. We're going to look now at the different types of cells that can exist when we talk about epithelial tissue. We can classify cells according to their shape, but also according to the number of layers that there are making up the tissue. So let's have a look first at a few different terms describing a cell's shape. The first one is squamous. Squamous means sort of scaly or flat, and so these cells take on a flat shape. The next one is columnar, and they kind of look like this tower or long column. And then the third type is cuboidal. It takes on a cube shape. Now, if we look at how they can be described based on or called a name based on the amount of layers, we have simple, which just simply means there's one layer. And here's an example of that. You can see one layer. Now, how do you know it's one layer? Well, it's based on that basement membrane. So there's one layer of cells on the basement membrane. As soon as you have cells that are not coming into contact with the basement membrane, so maybe a layer above this, it's no longer considered simple. Stratified means multiple layers, so you're going to have two or more layers. And so this is an example here, but we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers, but 2 or more is considered stratified. And then in this last example, we have what's called pseudo-stratified. The prefix pseudo means not real, or it can be defined as not genuine or a sham. And so we have pseudo-stratified. We know stratified means multiple layers. So this is saying here that it's a tissue that looks like it has multiple layers, but it doesn't really. It's a sham. So if we look at this example here, it does look like there's multiple layers, but how we know that there's not is because if we follow each cell down, every single cell comes into contact with that basement membrane. And so that tells us that it is actually a single layer. It just looks like it's more than one. Whereas with the multiple layers, you can see it is distinct that none of these cells up here come into contact with the basement membrane. And so what we'll see next is how we can combine these names together to represent a particular tissue. In terms of the coloring that you see, just an incidental note here, the coloring comes from staining techniques, and it makes the cytoplasm of the cell pink and the nucleus purple. What you can see here is some different cell or tissue types where there is a single layer of epithelial tissue. And when it's a single layer, we know we're going to be using that term simple, or we're going to be using the term pseudostratified because it just means that it looks like there's more than one layer, but there's actually only one. So Let's look at some examples, starting with simple cuboidal. This type of tissue is most commonly found lining glands in the body. Glands secrete substances, and ducts release substances. A common location of simple cuboidal epithelial tissue is in the kidney. And how that would look is like this: a single layer because it's simple, and then cuboidal because of the shape. In our next example, simple columnar epithelial tissue, this is more commonly found lining our hollow visceral organs. So that would include the digestive tract, which are, a lot of it is tube-like structures that's hollow where food would pass through. The uterus is another hollow structure, and so is our respiratory tract. And it would look like this here. Cube-shaped, and we know it's a single layer because it's simple. They are going to be, the cells, these simple columnar cells are going to be different depending on where they're located. So for example, and we'll see this a little bit more later on, some simple columnar epithelial tissue will need to have goblet cells, which produce mucus and secrete mucus. Others will have substances called cilia, which we talked about are sort of hair-like structures that allow for the sweeping action of things that we don't want in that hollow organ. And they also will, some of them will also have microvilli, which are small structures that I talked about in class where our digestive tract would look like this, allowing for us to absorb food kind of all along these layers. Compared to if it was just a straight line, we can only absorb food along that straight line or nutrients. So this increases surface area, the presence of microvilli. So this is a microvilli and this is a microvilli, and so on and so forth. Next up is simple squamous epithelial tissue. This is going to be commonly found as part of endothelium. When we hear the term endothelium, you can associate it immediately with the vessels in our body, our blood and lymphatic vessels. They're all lined with epithelial tissue, specifically simple squamous epithelial tissue, but they get a different name, or just a slightly different name where the prefix is different, and the prefix in this case is endo. And that prefix endo just means within. It's also found, this simple squamous epithelial tissue is also found as part of our mesothelium, which is a type of epithelial tissue that gets a slightly different name, where it's present as part of our lungs, heart, and abdomen. Meso just means middle. We also find this type of tissue in our kidney and also within our lungs. This type of tissue, simple squamous, is quite permeable to many substances, and it would probably make sense to if you looked at it as to why. Look how flat the surface is, so it's going to be fairly easy for substances to move through it. And then finally, we have pseudo-stratified columnar epithelial tissue. This is the fake multi-layered tissue. It's actually just one layer. And when it comes to its appearance, the cells are of differing heights, which gives it the appearance that there are multiple layers. But as I mentioned to you, all may rest on that, will rest on that basement membrane, but they won't all necessarily reach the free surface. And you can see that here. If this is the free surface, then you can see this structure doesn't reach the free surface. This cell doesn't reach the free surface. And their nuclei are present kind of all in different places, which also gives it an appearance that there's multiple layers. I had mentioned to you earlier that epithelial tissue can be modified depending on what the purpose and location of that tissue is. If it's in its unmodified form, it would look just like what we've looked at in the past. Just basic layer of cells, single layer of cells that in this case are columnar. So we're just focusing, in this case, on a single layer of columnar epithelial tissue. Here are some of the modifications that can exist. The first example is ciliated. We've talked about that before. This is commonly found in the respiratory tract. And what it will do is allow for the sweeping of substances along our respiratory tract. So if you breathe something in, then these cilia can sort of sweep the dust in an upward direction so that it doesn't end up in your lungs. And so it would look like this. So it's like a broom almost, or hair it looks like. Microvilli, I talked about those already in the small intestine. That'll be kind of shaped like this to increase surface area for absorption. It's just more efficient that way. You can see those present here, so they do look slightly different than these hair-like structures. These are more uniform, and they're not moving like these guys would be. Goblet cells are found all throughout the body, and they will work to produce mucus, as already mentioned, to lubricate substances that are passing through our body. So this is a goblet cell with some mucus within it. And you can see that some tissues will actually have both. So for example, in our respiratory tract, we have both cilia and goblet cells. And that's why if you are sick or maybe if you have allergies, you might cough up some mucus, and that mucus was produced to trap some of the substances that are present within your respiratory tract, just as an example. So what we've had a look here at is that simple columnar epithelial tissue can be modified according to what its function is going to be. And I just wanted to go back to the previous slide for a moment where I had spoken about, originally I had mentioned that simple columnar epithelial tissue is modified for secretion, and that's true, we just spoke about it. But what I wanted to add into here is that sometimes simple cuboidal epithelial tissue can also be modified according to what it needs to do. But again, our focus was on the simple columnar epithelial tissue being modified with cilia, microvilli, and goblet cells. So those were single layer examples. We're now going to look at many layer examples. So this we know is called stratified, and the three types are transitional epithelium, also known as urothelium, stratified cuboidal, and stratified squamous. So these two we know how to describe. This would be multiple layers that are shaped as cubes, whereas this one is multiple layers that are sort of flat and scale-like. But what about transitional epithelium? This is actually my favorite type of epithelial tissue because it's so cool in its function, and it is going to be 10 plus layers thick, so many layers, and it's going to protect an organ wall from tearing, and it's found in the urinary bladder. That's why it gets the name urothelium. Uro is referring to your urinary tract. So this is a specialized type of stratified epithelial tissue that is called urothelium. So how it works, if we look at this image here, when the bladder is relaxed, you can see stratified appearance, so multiple layers of cells. But then once your bladder is full, those cells stretch out, and they have to be able to stretch out because your bladder can go from being quite small to quite large depending on how much you let it fill. And it needs to be able to transition from this appearance to this appearance, because if it doesn't transition, then it will be damaged. So it has to have that ability to transition. Now we're looking here at stratified cuboidal. This is very commonly found in areas where protection is needed. It's found in sweat glands, the ducts of sweat glands, the pharynx, and the epiglottis. And really, oftentimes, whenever there's multiple layers, it makes sense that there's going to be some form of protection. In our final example, we have stratified squamous epithelial tissue, and this is what it looks like here. So you can see that there's multiple layers. This is the free surface, and this would be down on the basement membrane. And These cells don't necessarily take on a squamous appearance, but the cells closer to the free surface do. And these types of cells or this type of tissue are found in places where there's going to be a fair amount of wear and tear because of constant physical contact. So the skin, the vagina, the mouth, the esophagus are all sort of protected by this stratified squamous epithelium. I'll give you an example. When, let's say you're eating a cracker and you don't chew it well enough and you swallow it and you can feel it scratching all the way down, that you can thank the stratified squamous epithelial tissue from protecting you from damage that could otherwise be caused. We've spoken a lot about epithelial membranes and the tissue throughout our body that has many different functions, but we're going to look now at glandular epithelial tissue. And the glands in our body that are made up of epithelial tissue have specialized function to produce and secrete a substance. The two types of glandular epithelium that exist are exocrine glands and endocrine glands. Exocrine glands are going to be producing a substance, and then they're going to release the substance into ducts right in the area where it's needed. So in other words, these glands are found in the area that they're needed, and then they release their substances in that same area. So they're not traveling long distances in the body. So an example would be, and this is one of many, that in our stomach we have glands that exist, and these glands are going to produce stomach secretions that are important for the digestion process, and so they produce them there and then they release them through a duct also there. Whereas endocrine glands, these don't have ducts, but what they do is they produce substances, particularly hormones, and release them usually into the blood. Sometimes it's into the interstitial fluid in the area, but we will oftentimes talk about their release into the blood. And so we can see in this image here that we have these cells that are going to produce something, let's say a hormone, and it's going to release that hormone into the blood so that it can travel to where it needs to go. And it could be a very long distance. It could be something that's secreted at the level of the brain that's traveling all the way to the reproductive organs, for example. Okay, let's elaborate on exocrine glands. Remember, these glands have ducts that allow them to release whatever they produce right in the area. And we have three different types: apocrine, holocrine, and merocrine. And the first one we're going to look at is apocrine. An example of an apocrine gland is the mammary gland, and this is found in the breast and is going to be responsible for producing and releasing milk. And so what it does is it secretes its product. So let's look up here at the example. It produces its product in the cell. Then the product reaches the free surface or the apical part of the cell where it sort of pinches off, and then it starts collecting in this hollow area here. It might surprise you to learn that this actually damages a little bit of the cell in the process, but the repair is quite quick. The next example is a sebaceous gland. This is producing an oil that lubricates your skin. And the sebaceous gland example is shown here, where the secretion is going to be collected inside the cell, and then the cell is going to rupture and accumulate in that area. And the cell is literally sacrificing its life in order to do this, because it dies when it's being released, but regeneration occurs quickly. In our final example, we have merocrine glands. They're found in numerous locations in the body, and they secrete the material that they produce directly through the cell membrane. So we can see that in this example here, that it's going to produce something, and it's going to be, you can see these small substances being released through the plasma membrane of the cell. Many secretory glands in our body are merocrine glands, and you should know that the cell membrane is actually not damaged with this type of secretion, but with the other two we have some damage and complete damage. An example that you can make note of a merocrine gland, even though there are many in the body, is the salivary gland. So your production of saliva. Now we're moving on to our second tissue type. We've spent so much time talking about epithelial tissue. We're now going to look at connective tissue. And remember that muscle and nervous tissue will be talked about in a lot more detail once we get to those units. The role of connective tissue, there are many. It's going to be involved in connection, support, transporting, and protecting the body. And connective tissue consists primarily or predominantly of the extracellular matrix. So there's not a whole lot of cells. It's primarily that extracellular matrix. And depending on its constituents, it might be more fluid, more gel, or more solid. And we'll look at different examples coming up. The extracellular matrix is going to be made up of a lot of fibers, and these fibers are made by cells called fibroblasts. So they're cells that produce fibers. And in particular, those fibers are called either collagenous, reticular, or elastic. And depending on how much is present of each of these will change the texture of the connective tissue. And so depending on what area of the body it is and what we're essentially using it for, it's going to consist of a different percentage of each of these fibers. It also possesses proteoglycans. Proteoglycans are going to help thicken, lubricate, and hold tissues together. It also contributes to forming this physical antimicrobial barrier, so a barrier against microbes. And that's because the extracellular matrix is so thick, it's able to resist the penetration of microbes. We're going to have a look at the main types of connective tissue: bone, blood, cartilage, and fibrous, also known as connective tissue proper, and some of the main features. Starting with bone. Bone can be divided up into compact bone and cancellous or spongy bone. And just as a brief introduction, and we'll get into this in more detail once we get to this unit, but we have hard, very dense, compact bone here, and we also have cancellous bone up here that has like a spongy appearance. It's very porous, and it is going to contain fibers, but also a hard, mineralized extracellular matrix, which makes sense because bone is hard. Blood, on the other hand, is a liquid. It's still considered a connective tissue, but it doesn't contain any fibers in its extracellular matrix, which changes its overall consistency compared to that of bone. Another example or type of connective tissue is cartilage. We'll talk later about the three types: hyaline, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. They contain fibers and a rubbery substance. It's almost like a gel-like matrix. And then we have fibrous or connective tissue proper. There are different types that will be discussed briefly on upcoming slides, as you can see listed here, but we'll get back into that soon. And it contains a lot of fibers as well in its extracellular matrix. On the next slide, we're going to be elaborating on these three types of fibrous connective tissue. So the loose fibrous or areolar, adipose, and reticular. And those, remember, are fibrous connective tissue types. And then on a slide after that, we're going to be looking at dense connective tissue, which gets its own slide because there are three different types. And so because there are so many different components when we talk about tissue, I highly recommend that you create some sort of flow chart that can encompass all the different details around both epithelial and connective tissue. Okay, so on our next slide, what we have are these three types of fibrous connective tissue. Okay, these three here, which are fibrous connective tissues. So let's start with adipose tissue. Adipose tissue contains fat cells that are called adipocytes. And you can see this here is an adipocyte. It's full of stored triglycerides. And because of the stored triglycerides, we have this as an energy reserve. Adipose tissue also supports our body, offers protection. We have both white and brown fat. The white fat, it contributes to insulation, whereas the brown fat will allow for heat generation as needed. It's found all throughout the body, but it's more concentrated in certain areas. And so here's showing you a common distribution of adipose tissue in the body, slightly different, of course, for males versus females because of the different needs, in particular pertaining to reproduction. And as we'll see soon, adipose tissue does have some similarity to loose fibrous connective tissue, but we'll come back to that. Reticular tissue. Reticular means net-like. So reticular tissue has this network of branching fibers and cells. It provides stretch and flexibility in the structures that it's found, and in particular, it's found forming the framework of our spleen, our lymph nodes, these are immune organs, and our bone marrow. And this is showing you some reticular fibers and the cells scattered throughout it. The third type of fibrous connective tissue is loose fibrous connective tissue, also known as areolar. Areolar connective tissue or loose connective tissue contains a lot of fibroblasts. It contains fat cells, and that's where it has a similarity to the adipose tissue mentioned earlier that is similar to the loose fibrous connective tissue. And it contains white blood cells. And we'll see why that's beneficial in a moment. But the extracellular matrix is going to consist of these loosely woven fibers, both collagen and elastin fibers, in this soft jelly-like substance. A role of loose fibrous connective tissue includes the defense against microorganisms and other injurious substances. And that's because it contains a lot of white blood cells. So if we look over on this next image, we can see the presence of macrophages, which are a white blood cell, and mast cells, which are also a white blood cell. Plasma cells are a type of white blood cell. And then you can see some of the fibers. And when we say loose fibrous connective tissue, it's because the fibers are sort of loosely scattered throughout the area. And this type of tissue is found all throughout the body. It's the most widely distributed of tissues. And it's called a connective tissue because it does have fibers, so it's going to be contributing to the connection of structures in the body. Okay, so before we move on, let's make sure that we're understanding where we're at. What we just spoke about was fibrous connective tissue types. We looked at loose fibrous areolar, adipose, and reticular, right? These three here. And now what we're going to look at is dense connective tissue, which has its own subtypes. So dense fibrous connective tissue gets its name dense because it is densely packed with fibrous fibers. And it does not have a whole heck of a lot of cells within it because there are so many fibers. You'll see that it offers support and protection. The fibers are going to be collagenous or elastic, depending on which structure we're talking about, which type. And you can see there are three types here: dense irregular, elastic, and dense regular. And so the type of dense fibrous connective tissue is going to depend on the arrangement of the fibers and the ratio of these fibers within them. Elastic dense fibrous connective tissue is going to be found in some artery walls. But on the next slide, we're going to look a little more at the dense irregular and the dense regular connective tissue, which is going to contain more collagen fibers. It's going to be a tougher tissue than elastic fibers. Okay, let's look at dense regular and dense irregular and compare the two. And it has a lot to do with the orientation of the fibers within this tissue. So starting with dense regular, bundles of fibers are going to be arranged in regular parallel rows. That's why it gets the name dense regular, because they're organized in a regular fashion. More of an order to them, or seemingly. It's going to provide flexibility and strength, and we're going to find this type of tissue in tendons. Tendons, we'll learn, are going to anchor our muscles to our bones, and ligaments are going to anchor bones to bones. So if we look at this image here, you can see the nice orientation of these fibers, these dense, regular connective tissue fibers, where there's a lot of collagen that's present in comparison to the amount of elastic fibers that would be present. You can see this is showing you that it would be part of some ligaments. This is the shoulder, and also in tendons. But we'll learn more about those structures soon. Whereas dense irregular connective tissue, the fibers are sort of intertwined in an irregular fashion, almost forming a mat. And you can see that here, the way that they're designed. So the pull can be in either or direction, all different directions. Going to provide structural support to tissues and organs, but a very important location of dense irregular connective tissue is found within the dermis, which is the tough part of our skin. It is also found in other areas as well, parts of the kidney and the spleen, and some fascia of muscle, which is the outer covering of muscle. But dermis is certainly a big one, and we know our skin gets twisted and pulled in so many different directions, hence the orientation of the muscle fibers irregularly. Okay, now we're going to look at cartilage. So let's go back to our earlier slides so we know where we're at. We talked a lot about the fibrous connective tissue, finishing up with dense connective tissue, talking about irregular and regular primarily. And now we're going to look at cartilage. Okay, cartilage has really only one cell type present within it, and it's a chondrocyte. Cyte means cell, chondro refers to cartilage. And it's the chondrocyte that's both going to produce the fibers that are present that make up cartilage, but also the extracellular matrix. Another structure pertaining to cartilage that's important is called the lacunae. Lacunae means little lake, and it's areas within cartilage that are going to house the chondrocytes. So you can see the chondrocyte here within a little lake, or the lacunae. Perichondrium. Peri means around, chondro refers to cartilage, so this is going to be a structure around the cartilage, so it surrounds the cartilage. The fibers that are present in cartilage are a blend of collagenous and elastic, and it's going to the ratio is going to depend on the type of fiber that, or rather the type of cartilage that we're talking about, which we'll see on the next slide. Cartilage is also avascular, so in order for it to get any nutrition, it's dependent on the nutrients to diffuse through the matrix to actually reach the cartilage. Cartilage, you might know this from previous injuries yourself, but it does heal very slowly, and that's because it doesn't have its blood supply within it, and diffusion of nutrients occurs at a much slower rate than if there was blood supply. On our final slide, finally, we're going to talk about the types of cartilage that exist. We talked about it generally on the previous slide. We have hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. Let's have a look at the location. Hyaline cartilage you're going to find on the ends of articulating bones. This means that when you have one bone that comes in contact with another bone, so let's say your elbow, those bones are going to be lined with hyaline cartilage, which allows it to articulate or move. When you see articulation, it's referring to a joint. We'll talk more about that soon. Hyaline cartilage is the most prevalent cartilage. Think of all the joints that we have in the body, and they're all covered in hyaline cartilage. and it will prevent wear and tear on the articulating surfaces of bones, which I'm sure makes sense. And there's some images. Next up is fibrocartilage. This is a very tough tissue that's found in between the vertebrae of our spine. If you've heard of discs before, it's a fibrocartilage. Our knees contain meniscus, which I'm sure you've heard of, that is made of fibrocartilage. And the pubic symphysis, which is a structure where your pubic bone is, that we'll talk more about in later lectures, also has fibrocartilage, so this will come up again. And so that toughness is going to be because it contains a lot of collagen fibers that make it very tough and less of those elastic fibers. As I've already mentioned, it's the strongest and most durable of our cartilage, and it's going to allow for shock absorption as you're walking and moving and your joints are being stressed. And then finally, elastic cartilage found in the external ear and your voice box is going to be much more flexible. And so because it's more flexible, it contains more elastic fibers, allowing for strength, but also flexibility. So that's the end of this lecture on tissues. Thank you so much for your time.